Just a few words before I launch the proceedings properly. I think what I'd like to ask you, I know I've told you, or I've asked you all to prepare quite a 7-minute speech, delivery, and you will obviously say whatever you want to say, but I hope at least that it will address this basic issue that I think is at the core of the whole panel, and that is the relationship, the very European relationship between the concepts of man, citizen, and, shall we say, Estonian or Latvian or Russian in this instance. Basically, man, citizen, and the representative of an ethnic unit, a speaker of a language. Do we have losers? Do we really have losers in our societies, as Professor Prof intimated? Do these losers speak a certain language? Are there really secret echoes of the Soviet era in what's going on in Estonia, even in terms of language policy? Is there, or what is the role that the EU could play here? I somewhat doubt that the EU would be in a position to fulfill the deepest needs of our citizens at every level, but in any case there is certainly a space, a scope for European individualism. And again, where does that fit in? Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Triin Vihalemm, one of the chief authors of the language chapter in the book I assume you will have all read by now, the Estonian Human Development Report, which also addresses issues pertaining to Latvia and Lithuania. The floor is yours, Professor.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to speak sitting here among other panelists. So, thank you for the introduction, and maybe at first I shall introduce briefly this language policy in 3 Baltic states, and after that describe and also a little bit raise questions about the links between language policy, citizenship and democracy. In general, the legal framework that is in the meaning of language laws was and is still quite similar in 3 Baltic countries, but actually its implementation has varied, especially when we compare Lithuania with Latvia and Estonia. Lithuania, who actually have best starting position considering the relatively small number of inhabitants and not knowing Lithuanian, could afford far more self-regulation and less intervention via explicit policies. And in the first decade of independence, when Estonia and Latvia exercised mainly restrictive policy in establishing language criteria on the labour market, for example, and also to political participation, Lithuania applied also, that is in parallel, educational means by working out and implementing the teaching system of Lithuanian as a second language. And today, as my colleague Maruste has shown in her sub-chapter, which is in Human Development Report, the usage of Lithuanian language predominates in the public sphere, even in the cities where non-Lithuanians are in majority. In Latvia and Estonia, the language practices have changed more slowly. The language policy has been more massive, more oriented to control and to external incentives, both negative and positive, actually more negative. And today, Estonia and Latvia have again the situation where most of the population with other mother tongue report to know the national language at least passively, and roughly speaking, 1/3 part report to use it in public sphere. But before speaking about more sophisticated forms of democratic participation, let's look at simple things: life satisfaction, feeling of security, and future visions. And the question is to what extent the ethnicity or also acquired language skills count here. This table represents results of a statistical analysis called regression analysis. To put it simply, it depicts so-called poor connections between two variables, and then the variables which were analyzed there in this model were from one side ethnicity, language knowledge, and life satisfaction, economic self-evaluation of one's economic situation, and also the visions about future. And let's compare Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania according to this very simple model. In Estonia, the knowledge of Estonian as a second language is statistically significantly related to self-estimated quality of life and economic situation. In Latvia and Lithuania, such connection was not evident, but the ethnicity differentiates people's assessments. We may say that in Estonia, national language has become a medium of wealth, medium of social stratification, distribution of benefits. So we may also conclude at the first glance, looking only at this very table, that the societal context in Estonia seems to be more liberal compared to Latvia and Lithuania, with a more essential characteristic, that is, ethnic belonging differentiates the people's assessments. Considering that, we may ask, are there good grounds for launching so-called assimilative competition, as David Leighton hypothesized already in the middle of the 90s? However, in-depth analysis of both quantitative and qualitative data rather suggests that Estonian language learning and its usage has predominantly an instrumental meaning, and that is Russian language that carries a symbolic meaning what enables to communicate the shared experiences, desires, and also deprivation. For example, the Russian-speaking people tend to ascribe worse possibilities to their ethno-linguistic groups, even when their own experience is positive and perspectives are good. Also, sociological data suggests the rise of collective representation and feeling of togetherness based predominantly on the Russian language and personal communication networks. Comparative qualitative data gathered in Russia and in Estonia indicates that Estonian Russians have adopted rather a pattern of ethnic minority construction, and they define their Russianness in other terms compared to Russians in Russia. That is ethnization of Russian speakers rather than their gradual assimilation to Estonian medium public sphere that Estonia faces in the coming years. When at the labour market practices the usage of Estonia is widely adopted, then as was shown previously, roughly speaking, only every second Russian is ready to enter the Estonian language public sphere. And in this context, of course, a question arises, how much does the current integration policy that visions in the longer time perspective the civic identity to grow out from the democratic participation experience in the Estonian language public sphere reflects the reality? Let's come back to the other Baltic states in the table. Lithuania has performed the best position in terms of language skills and also political prerequisites for democratic participation. And the language skills are spread rather equally across the different subgroups of population, in contrast to Estonia and Latvia, where the linguistic capitalization is concentrated mainly into the group of younger and more educated people. But still, as we can see, the assessments of quality of life and economic position in society, as well as the certainty about the future, differ by ethnicity. Compared with Latvia, the differentiation is even more big in this model, because in Latvia, the people's assessments to their economic situation do not depend on ethnicity. Indeed, in Lithuania, the dissatisfaction with the economic situation is highest among the Russian-speaking population when we compare with Lithuania and Estonia. There may be, of course, various explanations, beginning from the historically formed structural differentiation in society and ending perhaps with the same phenomena as was briefly mentioned in case of Estonia, that is a certain kind of collective stigma and marginalization. In Latvia, neither language nor ethnicity differentiates the feeling of economic security. Svetlana Djachkova, who wrote about Latvia in our chapter, probably knows better, but I bet that the feeling of uncertainty was high among all groups of population, at least in the time of our Baltic Human Development Survey was carried out this spring. Considering the fact that the usage of Latvian and the labour market is less spread in Latvia compared to Estonia, we may hypothesize that in the longer existence of the two language spaces in parallel in Latvia. Thus, despite the differences in the linguistic practices, it seems that the different ethno-linguistic spaces are reality in all three Baltic states, and I will have to consider also with these realities in the coming years. Thus, the question about links between ethnicity and language and democracy is more than justified. And with this statement, I would like to give the word over to other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is very much in the direction that I was hoping to take the discussion here. I will now hand the floor to, if I can hand the floor to Professor Vello Pettai, who I'm sure will tell us something more about things like, is there such a thing as Esto-liberalism or Esto-democracy?
I will certainly try. Thank you, Ahto. I would just like to say link actually the two elements of our panel here, namely language and democracy, and begin with the first one, in the sense that language, in fact, is a proxy, or let me put it this way, behind languages stand actually ethnic groups. Right? Languages are spoken by distinct communities, and if we look deeper then at ethnic groups, they in fact are composites of not only language but also education issues and culture and community sort of structure and community identity and other things like that. And here's the big sort of and on the end, and their preservation, right? And their maintenance and their sustaining for generations to come. And the maintenance or the preservation of such communities, so including language and educational opportunities and cultural opportunities, etc., requires actually a certain amount of political power. Right? It requires political resources. It requires opportunities and rights to practice those activities, and it requires resources to make sure that you have the schools, you have the wherewithal to engage in those linguistic cultural practices. So that's language sort of writ large, in fact, expanded to the notion of ethnic groups. Democracy now is supposed to give people those rights, right? It's supposed to give people that power and those opportunities and those resources through basic human rights, of course, through going a step further up the chain than through political participation, voting, free speech. Then ultimately the next level is actual representation, right? Actual power to speak in decision-making bodies, and perhaps going all the way up to the presidency, or whenever you would like to take that. But the purpose, the idea is that democracy then actually in its ideal is supposed to provide those resources to those groups to achieve their linguistic, cultural, educational, ethnic group aims. So with those two conceptual underpinnings, then let me just move to the empirical situation, which is of course that here in the Baltic states and again with some greater emphasis on Latvia and Estonia, the problem is compounded or complicated because of the fact that for some ethnic groups, those political resources are limited. And they were limited in the beginning years of restored independence. For reasons, often seen as subjective, linked to the legacy of the Soviet rule, linked in specifics to citizenship principles and citizenship legislation, and then alongside that, the political element of nation statehood, which also Professor Vogt stressed, that this is sort of the state model in all three of these countries is one of nation statehood for the titular populations, if you will, the Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians. So this comes alongside your basic universal rules of democracy, if you will. I think this is something that he was trying to bring out as well, is that most political scientists focus on these universal constitutional, whatever legal elements of democracy, which are out there for everyone, and include also international human rights provisions, etc. And yet you also have perhaps a parallel issue of nation statehood principles, but nevertheless they can also be in conflict at times. And I think that when we talk about multi-ethnic societies, and with such ethnic groups focused on the preservation of their language and ethnic communities, then the democracy principle facilitates their preservation, but the nation-state principle may, however, run in contradictory nature. So there I see the crux of the problem here, and we're sort of, to reiterate, dealing with sort of universal phenomena of ethnic groups and their needs and aspirations, but then also specific political parameters and legacies that we have related to Soviet rule and to the most recent history. So many people would like to, many people focus on one or the other, right? We have universal human rights perspectives that would like to somehow erase or wipe out the historical issues and see that these are too particularistic, sometimes maybe even too narrow or cynical, or simply sort of anti-humane in terms of promoting a nation-state agenda. Others see the opposite, which is that of course universalism and democracy has gone too far and there's too many ethnic particularities to be maintained. Over the years, of course, now if we take the 20-year perspective, if you will, then the situation, as we well know, has not escalated or gone necessarily out of hand, with a few nights at the end of April and the beginning of May 2007 here in Tallinn accepted. And therefore, we can note that there is nothing that has gone outside of regular bounds, if you will. Things have been kept within democratic politics. But the problems have not been necessarily alleviated so much, to take the simple statistics on either non-citizens in Estonia or Latvia, or educational debates in Lithuania, or language debates and even attempted referenda in Latvia that are going on right now. So we're still in a mix, and what I would like to also add from the politics chapter that we worked on in the Human Development Report is the fact that, of course, across political parties, the ethnic divisions remain relatively strong, and this is indicated by, of course, many of the perceived ethnic political parties in these countries as not having come into government as yet at all, or not willingly seen in government to lesser or greater degrees. But this division then is there as well. Now, of course, I cannot talk about any of this without mentioning the geopolitical dimension, which adds perhaps even a third aspect. So it's not just the democracy, universalism, the nation-state principle, but it's the fact that there is a geopolitical dimension to the minority-majority issues. So I don't mean to overlook that in any way, but I think that those are the sort of ways and the parameters, indeed, that I would present this. And wholeheartedly subscribe to what Heinrich Vogt said about there being a certain dilemma here, and my conclusion is that we are working through that dilemma. It is a very slow process. Over 20 years, perhaps there might have been greater progress. There may be still further forces that come to bear on the Baltics to speed that process. But for the moment, we're sort of a few inches down the road. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very stimulating presentation. So what we have here is at least in two of the countries, a multi-ethnic society that operates within a nation state. And as we work through the dilemma, as you said, I'm assuming there would have to be, or there would be at some stage, a merger of the two continents. They would be coextensive, ideally, at one point. I'm wondering if we know at this point whether, at the point of that merger, that society would be monolingual, or whether additional languages would be imported in some sense into the nation-state context. Obviously, this is an open question, I think. But that seems to me to be the crux of the matter in the very long term for Estonia and Latvia. And also to get a Latvian view on things, we have Professor Andris Kambro, the Vice Rector of the University of Latvia, and the first of our two non-Titular, or non-Estonians, and then we welcome you for that as well.
Thank you. Actually, I did some contribution to the chapter of education, and in context of this panel, I could maybe add some characteristics and maybe some results about the situation, education situation in Latvian education, language situation in the Latvian education system, and some results in terms of quality of education, because in many contexts, when we are speaking about reforms in this field of education touching language issue, then very often the arguments are about quality, but maybe it's only some slogans, some cases, results, some research and so on. Yes, and the situation now, if we are looking to school system, firstly, we have minority education programs and education programs which are in the language of instruction. These programs are state Latvian. Minority education programs, of course, the biggest number of programs and students is in these school children. These are minority education programs with Russian language of instruction. But we have altogether minority education programs or schools, about 6, I think. Estonian school, Lithuanian school, Jewish school, and Polish, and Ukraine, probably. We have, but this is, of course, few students, only 1, 2 schools. But in this Russian minority programs and schools, this could be schools and could be only programs. In schools, there are programs in state language too. So such kind of schools we have too. In this minority programs with Russian language of instruction, we have about 25%. But in this last 20 years, this number of students there in these programs decreased very much. But now still, I think in Estonia the same trend, and I know from our work in this publication, the same trend, and now is less than 20% in minority education programs. We call this in Latvia. And here is a different situation in these programs, a little bit different situation in basic school, grade 1 till 9, and upper secondary school, grades 10 till 12. Yeah? Because in minority programs in basic school, these schools are encouraged to do some subjects bilingual, but actually these are minority programs. State examinations within grades 3, 6 and 9 are in Russian language, and these are minority programs. Of course, Latvian language and other subjects about Latvian history and so on, history of Latvia is included very much in these programs, but this is still minority programs. In upper secondary school, we did changes, 40% curriculum in state, in Russian language, and 60% curriculum in state language in years 2004-2005. I think in Estonia, I know these reforms just now is going on. This reform, yeah. Maybe this is only reform in field of education where we in Latvia we were first. But if you are looking now about quality in these education programs, in some measurements, to compare programs in state language and in programs in minority language, Russian and now. In upper secondary school, all the time, this centralized examinations in grade 12 were in Latvian language. I mean these items which are sent to schools to these examinations, in different subjects, these are Latvian. But students, 12th grade students, they can answer or in Latvian or in Russian, give answers to these centralized examinations till now. Yeah? And what are firstly, what language they are choosing for answers. This is about 50 and 50. Half of students chosen to answer to these examinations in grade 12 in Russian language, and about half in Latvian language. And what are results in these examinations? Yeah? Centralized examinations. This is examinations which are content is centralized and marking is centralized. It's not in school. It's in school. Yeah? This is coded on the number. It's not family names and so on. And this is centralized. Has centralized marking. Results are such in these minority programs for students in these minority programs. If we are looking to language in which are given answers, in subjects, science subjects, physics, mathematics, not mathematics, physics, chemistry, biology, the results are the same. Or students answering these centralized examinations here or in Latvian language or in Russian language. This minority program students. Yeah. But in math and history, results are a little bit different, because if students are giving answers in Russian, then results are a little bit better than if they are giving these answers in examinations in Latvian language. This is about, but generally if you are looking, now I spoke about this minority program, but generally if you are looking to results of centralized examinations in upper secondary schools in minority programs and in the programs in state language, then actually in these science subjects, these minority program students are a little bit higher in general results. If we are looking now to basic school on about this quality, then quality is equal for minority programs and for programs in state language. Because here we having this international studies too, different, more famous and are OECD PISA study, for example, for grades 8, 9, this international tests, this external view to our education quality. Then is no difference in Latvia. In Latvia is no difference between reading literacy, so-called, or math or science literacy for students from programs, we can say, is Latvian language instruction or Russian. This is no difference. This is mentioned in this chapter about languages in the report too, because in this case, minority programs, which are working actually mainly Russian language, or state language programs, the same quality of the end of basic education. And maybe a few words about situation, language situation in, I could add to this question. Generally, if you are now speaking, because we did this reform in upper secondary before 6 years, 5, 6 years, the question is enough. We looked or studied enough, enough how is working this 40% to 60% within this minority education programs and so on. Of course not. But I think we spoke yesterday here about research is needed, but not always there is resources, or maybe resources, money resources, and not maybe only money resources. This is maybe one question, but probably another question was actually because probably you heard then in years 2000, 2005, it was relatively, this was not easy reform, it was relatively big protests from different, from students to school children, and teachers, and not only from this part of society or so. And it was, I think, decided or not decided to maybe not to do research in first years, to do major control there in these programs in the beginning of reform, but now it's 6 years. And lastly, maybe about higher education situation, language situation in higher education. Probably here are a little bit differences between Estonia and Latvia, I think, because by our law of higher education, in state higher educational establishments, universities, study language instruction, you can say, studies are led. In private higher educational establishments could be any language of instruction, but for this state higher educational establishments or state universities, there are some exclusions when and how we can use another languages. But these another languages are so-called, this is written in law, European EU languages. It means English and other languages, yes, but Russian language no. And this question, in what cases we can use? If we have student groups, foreign student groups, in our universities, then we can use EU languages, of course, as a standard. we can use for our programs for our students in 20% of curriculum we can deliver in other languages. Not for foreign students, but for our students. And if there are programs, for example, English philology or Russian philology, of course, and so on. This is a situation in higher education about law. And this is discussed, this is political question, because we had some amendments for law just now, this summer, and I think from media I know and in parliament, one of the biggest discussion was about changes in this regulation about language in higher education. Result was such what I am now. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Another fascinating topic. Obviously, education is the harbinger of things to come. Estonia, in this respect, as Professor Hogan-Brun noted as well, is testing the same waters as Latvia did a couple of years ago, or 5-6 years ago. And I'd like to invite Mailis, Member of Parliament, but also former Education Minister, to say a few words about the situation in Estonia.
Thank you very much. If you may, I will start out with a few comments on the language issue and then I come to the education. Otherwise, I could talk about the education too long. In terms of the language issue, I see, similarly to our previous speaker, our colleague from Latvia, that Estonia and Latvia in that sense are similar, that the language issue as such has been the political question on its own. We have not really, on a political level, discussed language, the state language, as a tool. And that has been, at least the last decade, one of the major problems why we have not really been successful in our integration, by my understanding. Because if you're talking about the language, especially as if we look at the development report where Professor Vihalemm has very nicely put it, that there is such an academic excellence expected from the speakers. Once you enter the Estonian language on state language level, you have to have it on a very high level. I don't talk about only that it needs to be C1, but people who participate in our conversations, we expect them to do it grammatically purely correctly. And we are very harsh on somebody who has even the slightest accent, not talking about making maybe a bit funny mistakes. It's not only on a media level, even on a social level, we are not very tolerant on the speakers who are, okay, except on somebody who is an ambassador or somebody who is coming from EU country and just very fast has learned Estonian, then we are very acceptable. But once we come to the people who are maybe in the late 50s, 60s, and have started to make effort only in the last few years, we are always reminding them that they have been living here already for a few decades, and they should have done it already, and the learning period is over. So what this kind of intimidation has resulted is that there is a very low self-esteem and even very low expectation to learn the language, especially if you go into this educational sphere, into the teachers, and particularly in the areas which are separated and segregated. For example, on areas of Narva, where you have more than 98, 97% or almost all teachers, except of Estonian language school, would speak in everyday language and would consume the information in Russian, would speak Russian, and have in many times covered the courses, have done very successfully exams, and then in a few years later they have inspectors coming in and say, you know, sorry, but you have forgotten all the language. And then we question all the certificates, and we question their level of ability to do the exams. And even furthermore, it's politically abused, and as a result is that many of the teachers have kind of given up to study or to enroll to another course. So politically, it has been very interesting and useful tool. A language as such, you learn the language on an excellence level, and then you participate in life. If you don't learn in an excellence level, then it's your problem, you're a loser. And before our entrance to EU, I would meet a lot of people who had this expectation that because of free movement now, they can get rid of that because they go with a medium level English or German to somewhere else, and they are more accepted than in countries like Estonia or Latvia. The other question which of language policy I see the problem is that even if a young person has learned the language, there is among Russian speakers a very strong belief that that's not enough. And you can meet many of them who can very easily give you evidence, and it is again promoted in Russian-speaking media and shown that, okay, you learn the language, but then you have to do something else. And normally what the examples giving is that you have to give your belief in, for example, in historic events, especially related to the end of Second World War. And then it comes to the very sensitive topic. It's not only Estonian language you need to know, you also have to interpret the history different. Or the other example what they would give you very often is that you have to become very critical of Russia, especially today's and future presidents. Mostly it's related to Mr. Putin. And you have to become substantially critical in order to be accepted in Estonian society. And that's another issue which has been particularly interesting. Yesterday I came back from Sillamäe, and because of this conference here, I brought up this topic with many. And it is, again, a generally believed kind of feeling. So, coming down to the education and also what we can do as a future, what can we provide? But I have seen in 2005 when very sad and interesting events, fascinating events were going on in Latvia. I happened to work with my Latvian colleagues a lot, and what we found in Estonia was the many different things. First of all, in educational field, and it was prior our prompt soldiers, so there was much more acceptance from Russian speakers' side. There was a very general acceptance of state language. There was no question of among teachers or as well as parents to accept that Estonian is a state language. There is a very welcoming idea of learning the language. However, the method of doing it through the law and putting them restrictions and punishments and fine is very highly, let's say, criticized or even not appreciated. What most of these Russian speakers, especially parents, feel that first they want to feel that Estonian society as such is giving something back to them. So-called two-way of integration. First of all, one of their hesitations is history. How do we write our textbooks in history? Are we welcome to put in at least the question marks? Or is it there is only one interpretation? That was raised in almost all the schools. It was not expected that we write in a different way, but for example, terminology like occupation, winning or non-winning the Second World War should have been discussed by many of the history teachers' point of view, especially by parents. The second issue which was brought up is that there needs to be a systematic state-level support and advice to the schools, especially in terms of textbooks. And I can feel today in Estonia that's one of the problems that we tend to feel that to give them a normal, parallel Estonian textbook from Estonian school is enough. And that's a very big mistake we are making. And I know that in Latvia that was also the debate that until Latvians understood that you need to make some other effort in addition to that. And in terms of this self-respect and also pride, the other thing which was many times mentioned is that, for example, multi-ethnic society, discussion of multi-ethnic society should be brought also into Estonian language classroom. The other political question which I would like to bring here in our attention is that how we use the language policy in our political debates. Also in the last parliamentary election. For example, one of the new laws in Estonia is that all kindergartens have to start teaching Estonian by the age of 3. In reality, we are aware that there is not enough teachers. There's almost no good materials for using. There is a few non-profit projects and so on, but no systematic way. And many of the kindergartens have brought this attention on the state level, but we reply with the political slogans. And this is another thing which kind of undermines this thing that even if there is a willingness from the Russian-speaking society and parents to do it, and they're very willing to put their children into, and they actually choose to put the children to the kindergartens, where is very strong Estonian language. This is the best starting point. On a political level, we don't discuss it in substance. Our educational policy has been in the different stages On 2005-2006, we worked out a program where we started out of so-called one subject per year. And it was widely accepted. Today, the debate over percentages, 40-60, is taken much more critically, and it has led to the, I will find, very worrisome discussion in Estonia of further segregating the educational system. There is a very strong debate on education sector today to fund the private schools for Russian speakers and separate them even on not only on substance but also as ownership from the rest of the Estonian educational system. And that's something what I find in long term very worrisome trend. And it's not only in a few places in Estonia, but it's especially among Russian-speaking media, very widely accepted way out of this reform. And that's something which we need to definitely look into in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these fascinating insights into the other side of the education system in Estonia. The words double standards caught my ear, and I think this is a very good point at which to introduce into the proceedings Professor Rait Maruste, a Member of Parliament, a person who's had a very illustrious career in the judicial sphere, has been Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Estonia, but also spent 12 years on the European Court of Human Rights. Professor Maruste, thank you.
Thank you. Let me start from my little personal experience. As it was said right now, I was away from Estonia 12 years. And when I came back, I started to learn society again and what has happened here. And one of my biggest positive surprises was that so many young Russian origin people were fluent in Estonian language. Sportsmen were interviewed, so people were speaking in radio, you meet them on street, you go to the cafeteria, and they were almost fluent in Estonian language. And this situation wasn't so 12 years ago, I'm absolutely sure. And this was a great surprise for me. There has taken place a certain switch in mentality or attitudes. So, secondly, I want to come back to this video presentation given by Professor Vogt. And I picked up some his notions he used. He mentioned such a notion like national liberalism or nation liberalism, and also used the notion or category of ethnic egalitarianism. Maybe he he's fully entitled to see things like this, but to understand why things are as they are, we maybe should look back and not to forget history or development. For me, explanation, at least partly, is that our Baltic nations, especially Latvian and Estonian nations, were very close to lose, say, national identity, nation, culture and language. This was some kind of existential fear to lose it, which has lasted ages and ages. And then when the possibility came, you stick to it and try to revitalize it. Maybe it was a bit too strong effort on it, but it explains why things went as they went. Now we are talking about language and democracy. In true democracy, people should talk with each other, and they should understand each other. So they need common language, lingua franca. If we look around us, nowadays societies in Europe are multicultural societies, without any doubt. This is a fact of life. It's so in the Baltic states, it's so in elsewhere in Europe. So the question is how to make these societies functional, to talk with each other. If we look what has happened in other countries in Europe, we can see that in countries with big migration, if these newcomers are living in closed communities, they're using their own language, they communicate inside this community, their problems are coming up. All kinds of problems, social problems, criminal problems, criminality, etc. So there is no lingua franca in this community or in the state. These two societies, newcomers or not being those who are not part of the dominant nation, and the rest of the community, they don't communicate. If we look back into our history, long time during the Soviet period, the lingua franca for Baltic states was Russian language. To make or give a possibility to people to use it. It was forcibly through force put on us, and for a certain time in history it worked, but it didn't end up nicely. Now, the question is, what should be new lingua franca inside country and also outside the country? Because there are two dimensions. One is inside country, and another tendency which we didn't have a long time is communication with outside world, internationally. Nowadays, it's fully possible that people communicate with each other on individual basis, say, make contacts with non-governmental organizations, and say participate in European Union structures or other international structures. So there is also need for lingua franca. Let's turn back to this inside state situation. As I tried to explain, tendency in Europe is that inside country, the nation language is lingua franca. And if you want to communicate, make democracy working, you need to understand each other, and there is no other tendency seen in Europe that is, lingua franca should be nation language. Otherwise, immediately problems will pop up. Now, if we look how to communicate with the rest of the world where we are now, the lingua franca is European language, one of them. And all those who are present days using the Russian language still as a lingua franca, or they have to understand that Russian language is not the European Union official language. So there is less chances to make yourself heard and to have a communication to achieve your aims if you are using non-European language, if I may put it this way. So it makes one more argument in favor of having a good knowledge in one of the European Union languages, or Estonian, or Latvian, or Lithuanian, or English, or German. If you have you put your effort on Russian language, you will have less chances of making yourself heard in Europe. It's fact how things are standing, and we have to transmit this knowledge to all those who are living in Estonia. So, although I don't agree all what Mailis reps said, but one point I certainly agree that if we are present days living in multicultural societies, as I said, and I agree, and this is both ways situation, or it goes in both ways. The minorities are communicating with majority, and majority should also communicate with minority. And so, if we look our educational system in Estonia, probably we have to make more efforts to talk about multicultural societies also in Estonian schools and Estonian public life in general. We haven't done it too much, but certainly we have to do it to understand each other better and understand those who are living next to us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Another very intriguing presentation makes me think, at least, of whether there might be a difference between the sort of accepted European norms, say in continental Europe, and then what's going on in Scandinavia, where minority languages obviously stemming from very different historical contexts and circumstances are making inroads into majority languages, at least in regional contexts. And I have in mind, obviously, not just Swedish language in Finland, but also the Sami. But be that as it may, I now hand over the floor to another representative of the academic community with us, Dr. Gabrielle Hogan-Brun from Bristol, and hopefully with the view that's closest we get today here to God's eye view in terms of getting onto Estonia, getting onto the neighbourhood, having someone tell us things from a very different perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to carry on with the focus on language and integration, and as mentioned, I shall adopt a comparative perspective across Europe. In particular, I shall consider visions of language as a problem, as a right, or as a resource. Each of them will impact differently on integration. Language figures prominently in national integration agendas across Europe. As core social capital, they can be used as a central vector in integration politics. National approaches to the management of languages condition all aspects of socialization, including citizenship, education, and identity. Language management, as language policy itself, of course, are deeply embedded in prevailing linguistic ideologies. These ideologies, of course, are subject to change, as are approaches to integration as well. So this is just meant as a brief preamble to the rest of the talk. I'm not going to go through these triads, language as a problem, as a right, as a resource, as they apply to the Baltic context in what I would see as a chronological order. In the past, I would say the focus on language has been particularly, or more predominantly seen as a language as a problem. Of course, diverging language attitudes and practices still can be perceived and even experienced as a problem in many aspects. Another aspect is the achievement of a more symmetric bilingualism with the titular language. That, I think, also is still work in progress in many ways. In the West, language is being constructed as a problem too, more and more so, with increasing immigration and new multilingualisms arising, new languages that people don't really know or understand, and this is often perceived as a problem to integration. In this region, the idea of language and cultural testing has been pioneered, and this idea has then been copied in Western Europe as well, mainly for citizenship and residency applicants. The official rationale used in the West for language testing is that this is needed to promote social justice, cohesion, and also active citizenship. But there are critics who find that language testing isn't an adequate means to measure the degree of integration. Some question, in fact, the appropriateness of language testing on linguistic, ethnic, and legal grounds. And there are voices who say that these testing mechanisms of gatekeeping mechanisms to control immigration, in fact. As we move on to with a focus on language as a right, I think in the run-up to EU accession, this became more predominant in this region. Of course, the question of who can use which language in which social domain has proved to be very complex indeed. And there are also regional specificities, as in northeast Estonia, perhaps Daugavpils, and maybe even Visaginas area as well, to mention just a few. Such definitional matters have proved to be very controversial across Europe in the process of the legitimization of language rights. In the meantime, naturalization is more widely offered as a means to extend the right to citizenship. But there are contradictions as well. So the conditions of, for instance, the length of required residency and language requirements, they vary across Europe. And they keep changing across the predominant political discourse as well. Also, the idea of civic idea of consent in terms of citizenship is spreading indeed, but it still confronts with the more ethnic paradigm of dissent in terms of citizenship. I think this possibly links up with the presentation by Professor Fox earlier on, that in Western Europe you can observe a more rational, contractual relationship between citizens and the state, whereas here the mindset still tends to be more, shall I say, emotional, possibly collective in thrust. Maybe now the time has come to focus more on the ideal of language as a resource. In considering the potential of this vision, we can possibly ask, could more differentiated language policies open up a space for increased mutual cooperation, possibly enhance integration on linguistic grounds? Could maybe this help close the gaps between the linguistically divided communities in this region? Or could, in fact, the need to achieve commercial international competitiveness be a driving force in all this? In the West, means from below of differentiated language management policy practices at different levels and in different domains are being sought as a means of inspiration for good practice. In this richly multilingual region here, there surely is a great potential of language as a social resource as well. Could maybe flexible models be used as a means to exploit this resource? Is society ready to accept positive language rights, which this might require? So the ideal resource has been very prominent yesterday afternoon, as well as sustainability. In fact, it's been proposed that Estonia's greatest resource is the human resource. So maybe it makes sense to focus on this very issue here. Hence, I should project some questions for personal reflection, or indeed, if you would like to discuss this would be welcome as well. These questions are: how could effective use of existing language resources be exploited for competitive advantage? Could this be linked to the stated need as stated by Mario Lauristin yesterday, to harness intellectual resources more generally in order to transform knowledge and skills into revenue?
Thank you very much indeed. I must apologise, I have it on here as representing the University of Bristol, whereas I saw it was actually Basel. But in terms of distance, that makes very little difference, I think.
It's not a big mistake because I belong to both.
Oh, okay, great. Once again, a huge thank you to the panelists, and I now open the floor to you, the audience, and I hope there are one or two questions. Right, Mr. Aurora. I think we may have a microphone.
I'm Gabrielle, and actually I'm going to moderate the next panel, which will be more on economical issues. Therefore, I can't stand temptation to ask a question which is a bit provocative as well. Actually, there is a rather strong belief among some people that the language policy has enabled to exclude the language minority who happen to be economically industrialized people very much in favor of the large-scale state-owned enterprises during the Soviet times. Exclude them from the economical reforms, decision-making over the economical reforms, which actually enabled Baltic states, and particularly Estonia in this case, to carry on them in much better space, or much higher pace, and much more resultatively, in a sense. All the privatization issues which is in Russian language world are said against nature, in a sense. Here they had no say. So basically it was actually economical advantage for a while. Second point, whether you agree with it or not. And second point is related to the only slightly carefully mentioned background of this language policy in the Baltics. This is the being geopolitically challenged. Let's put it this way. And we know the name of the challenge. And this challenge is Russian. And this is the Russian language and the neighborhood of the very ambitious state, which has put local people, local politicians, and local population, not only because of the historical reasons, but also because of the fundamental fear for the future, into the very defensive position. Actually, multiplying this, what was said about the logics of the politics, language politics here, multiplying this effect, making it, how to say, last resort to stand. So basically, this is the question, whether it's true or not. But it seems to me that it is also part of the story. Somehow we tend to be so polite and correct in a nice European way that we do not name this geopolitical challenge anymore. Looking over it and saying that there is no such. But there is actually. We just read each and every day that it is growing again. So wouldn't it have a kind of negative impact also on the language policy issues?
Right. Thank you. I see Vello would like to start.
Yes, I really thank you for the question, because it echoes what was going through my mind listening to my fellow panelists, and particularly this notion of resource. And it's a nice one to illustrate some of the dilemmas that have been going on concerning language and more broadly democracy. I mean, I think you're so right to point out that in the early 1990s, there was an overlapping of this non-resource image of the Russian community, that the language could not have been a resource because it was part of a community that was part of Soviet industrial complex, which was no longer needed for us, and in fact not only not needed, but seen as an obstacle for decisive reform, and therefore, all of that delegitimizes the resource notion of Russian and of the Russian community. There may have been objective reasons for that. We know that there has been tremendous economic transformation thanks to the radical changes that were carried out in the early 90s, but nevertheless, from the perspective of at what point does Russian become a resource, then it's clear that in the early 90s it was anything but. If we look farther down the road, it still hasn't become a resource in the sense that the trade with Russia and the sense of now being able to open up a Russian market and engage with Russia is not there yet. I mean, slowly, Russia joins the WTO, maybe there'll be tremendous horizons opened up at that point, and they're fine. But I think most Balts are still wary, and certainly I think many politicians are wary. Don't forget the reaction that many Estonian politicians had after the bronze soldier incident, saying that, what about this tremendous boycott that's now going to come from Russia? And Estonian ministers saying, well, we don't care. We don't want business with Russia anyways. So that was being, as Anno Domini 2007, another message that Russia is not a resource. And finally, I think, I'll be a little bit pointy here as well in saying that I think the message from Professor Maruste was also that, well, Russian is not a resource because it's not a language of the EU, and therefore, we should tell the Russians here that, well, if you really want to stick with your Russian, reckon with the fact that within the EU you won't get anywhere because the Russian is not a language there either. So we have now many levels at which this lack of resource, size of resource.
Thank you. I was just wondering myself, I don't know the answer to this, but I think there might be people voting with their feet, though, parents making sure that their children know Russian. That's an interesting, if it's still the case, it would be an interesting phenomenon. Anyone else? Okay, I see a very skeptical look on that point.
I actually would like to respond to Raivo's question and remarks my co-panelists have made. The first thing about this impact of Russia and the links between attempts made by Russia, all this compatriots politics and so on, and our language policy and integration policy, which so far has much focused on the language issue. I would say that paradoxically, language policy and integration policy, at least in Estonia, has, I might say, even defended a little bit by creating quite different challenges and quite different life experiences to Russians living here in Estonia. I had no much time to explain about the differences of constructing and defining the Russianness, of being the very essence of being Russian. Russian here in Estonia compared to Russians living in Moscow and in other areas of Federation. It's very different, and the main dimension of making this difference is this minority experience, which is in a way linked quite strongly with this language experience. And in a way it so far has protected us in many ways by creating, as I mentioned also briefly, this pattern of quite minority identity creation, which is focused much on language issues. And from this experience, everyday life experience, from this micro-level life world, actually this identity which was so far offered from the side of Russia, like this idea of compatriot and strong civic identity, Rossiana, which has very strong imperial connotations, I must say is not very attractive. It's not according to this experience here. And my second remark was about this little bit illusionary perception that Russians living in Estonia, especially the younger generation, speak only on Russian. Absolutely not. They trust the English knowledge much more than Estonian. So it's the main competitor in their eyes to Estonian language, and the main alternative is not Russian, it's English.
Thank you. I have Professor Maruste first.
I'm very thankful to Vello about his second point about geopolitical element in this situation. This fight for geopolitical influence is not over yet, and it's in foreseeable future it will not disappear. So in these terms, our ultimate target is to make our communities peaceful, and our weakness is weak social cohesion. And if our societies would be more coherent through language, but not only through language, then we are more on the safe side. So in this social cohesion and stability, we should look closer to each other's eyes and understand each other better. This is without any doubt. So the challenge is how to do it. And so far, my personal conviction is development has gone in favorable direction. There are always problems. Problems are everywhere. You can see it in France, you can see it in Germany, in Sweden. So you can't say that there is some point in time in development that problems are solved and nothing should be done. But social cohesion is an important thing. Thank you.
Thank you. Mailis.
I'll start out with also on the second question. I mean, for how long? Yes, we started out politically and geopolitically discussing the fate of Russia and our statehood. But we are 20 years down the road. How long we keep this? Is it fifth of the society or is it 1/3 of society? Depends how we calculate, how big percentage is integrated. How long do we keep the Russian speakers separate because of the fear of Russia? Because that's the wishful way for Russians to keep them under their influence. And the bigger failure we do with our integration, the bigger favor we do for Russia, because then they are excluded from our information square, they are excluded from our society, and they are very easy target for Russian influence. The interesting thing is what already Professor Vihalemm said, that if you actually discuss, and not only with the young generation, but also their parents today, there is very little willingness to go back to Russia. Yes, there is a developing trend, which was not the case a few years ago, to go to study in Russia. It's a very interesting trend which probably needs to be studied separately, but after certain events in Estonia, after Prof showed him, the attractiveness of going to the best schools and universities in Russia came back as a wave. But before that, even that wasn't the case. So my argument would be also in Estonian society, yes, it sells very good, it's politically extremely useful, but as a result, it's very dangerous because Russians themselves don't relate so much to their Russia as such, but they relate to Russia and the local. And for me, the most interesting thing is, if you, for example, look at the football match for a few years ago, where it's a bit schizophrenic, where you see the Russian school children cheering for both sides, because Estonian teams has a lot of Russian-speaking members, so they would cheer for them, and then they would go against the Russians, and then would cheer for them. So it is a bit a schizophrenic situation, but at least there is a tendency to support both sides. In terms of economically, I think that's the time to now realize that they are resources. If you look at the service sector, there is a clear understanding there already, which you know very well, that if we look at the way and willingness of the people today doing the service sector to survive with Russian and Estonian parallel, and they're mostly ethnic Russians, it's definitely becoming a resource.
Thank you. And final remark now for Professor Hogan-Brun.
Thank you very much. I've been waiting to reply to the questioner, but was very happy to listen to what's been said in turn. You know, I fully understand the sensitivities and the deep meaning of your remarks made, because I'm quite aware of what's going on here and the very difficult geopolitical situation that is beyond any question. Of course, I'm speaking here as a linguist, and when I talk about language as a resource, I mean all sorts of languages, not just one particular language. You see, I see Estonia as being Estonian, as being close to the Finnish language, so there is an open door as well. And yesterday we were speaking very much about the Baltic-Nordic connection. I can see a mental link, a mindset that opens up to Scandinavia as well. So there's other doors, there's other languages there. And then of course there are all these Western languages too. So I was never, not for a second, thinking one particular language, but just languages as a resource. And it definitely, what I'm trying to get at is that your populations here, what I am noticing in daily life, they're very, very multilingual. You know, it's not unusual for somebody to be quite a good speaker of 4 languages, which actually in the West is a rare thing. So this ability to switch, this ability to just go along with the situation, that's what I see as a social resource. Do you get me? And to activate this.
I'm that person like this, so therefore I do it.
You're like that, yeah. So hopefully you understand each other.
I wasn't criticizing this, I was actually about the explanation why it has been a case here, this geopolitical challenge.
Yes, that makes total sense. But I mean it in a much wider sense than this. And also it was my last of the visions that I deliberately projected, meaning I was looking into the future as well.
Well, the Swiss model for Estonia, maybe not. But, time waits for no man. I've been told to terminate this very fascinating session, and also create an opportunity for Johanna here to hand over some keepsakes, souvenirs, apparently the red stuffs for the girls. There's no color coding, is there?